The boxing gym laughed when I signed up, not knowing I'd killed a man in the ring. The sound of their laughter echoed off the concrete walls of Southside Boxing Club as I filled out the membership form with shaking hands. There were 8 fighters scattered around the gym that Monday morning in October, some hitting heavy bags, others doing footwork drills, all of them glancing at me with barely concealed amusement. I was 32 years old, wearing a discount store tracksuit that hung loose on my frame, and I probably looked exactly what they assumed I was. Another middle-aged guy having a midlife crisis, thinking he could learn to box and feel tough. The gym owner, a thick-necked former cruiserweight named Cal Burton, took my $50 cash for the month and told me the beginner's class started at 6 p.m. He said it in a tone that suggested I'd quit within a week. I thanked him and asked if I could use the gym now, just to get familiar with the space. Cal shrugged and pointed toward some ancient equipment in the corner, the stuff nobody wanted to use. A speed bag with a torn leather cover, a heavy bag that leaked sand from a rip near the bottom, hand wraps that looked like they'd been white sometime in the previous decade. I walked over and started wrapping my hands, the movements automatic after 15 years away from boxing. My hands remembered even if I'd spent every day since trying to forget. One of the fighters, a muscular guy in his mid-20s with Reyes tattooed across his shoulder blades, stopped his workout to watch me wrap my hands. He nudged his training partner and said something I couldn't hear, but their laughter was clear enough. I'd been Dante Kozlov once, undefeated in 23 professional fights, Eastern European champion at 28, being groomed for a world title shot. That life ended 4 years ago in a ring in Budapest, when I threw a left hook that landed wrong and Viktor Popov never got up. The autopsy showed an undiagnosed brain aneurysm that ruptured from the impact. The investigation cleared me of any wrongdoing. The boxing commission ruled it a tragic accident. Victor's family sued me anyway, and the settlement took everything I'd earned. But none of that mattered compared to the fact that I'd killed a man doing something I loved, and I watched him die while 8,000 people screamed around us. I'd stopped boxing that night and moved to America a year later with a new name, a fake resume, and enough guilt to fill the Atlantic Ocean. My wife left me 6 months after the fight, unable to look at my hands without seeing them as weapons. My trainers and promoters moved on to other fighters, and I spent 3 years working construction jobs under the name Danny Cole, lying awake at night seeing Victor's eyes roll back in his head every time I closed my own. I came to Southside because I needed to know if I could still do it, if I could throw a punch without feeling Victor's skull crack under my glove. The nightmares had been getting worse, and my therapist said confronting the trauma might help, though she'd meant talking about it in group sessions, not actually returning to a boxing gym. I'd driven past Southside for 3 months before finally walking in this morning, and the moment I wrapped my hands, I felt 15 years of muscle memory flooding back. I hit the heavy bag 3 times, testing my form, feeling the impact travel up my arm. The bag was old and too light, but the feeling of leather connecting with canvas brought tears to my eyes. I'd forgotten how much I missed this, forgotten that boxing had been my salvation before it became my nightmare. I was born in Moscow to an alcoholic father and a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep us fed. Boxing gave me purpose, discipline, a way out of the poverty that crushed everyone around us. My trainer, Boris Fedorov, saw something in me at age 12 and spent the next decade molding me into a fighter who could have been great. Could have been. Past tense. Everything about my life was past tense now. Reyes walked over while I was hitting the bag, his arms crossed, a smirk on his face. "Yo, old man, you're gonna hurt yourself swinging that hard. This ain't a Tay-Bo class." His training partner laughed, a skinny kid with a neck tattoo that said, "Fearless," in elaborate script. I stopped hitting the bag and turned to face them, keeping my expression neutral. Reyes was maybe 175 pounds, welterweight division. Probably had 15 amateur fights and thought that made him a tough guy. I'd fought and beaten men twice as skilled before I was 20. But I wasn't here to prove anything to him, so I just nodded and said I'd be careful. That made him laugh harder. He told his partner that the gym was getting soft, letting anyone walk in off the street. The partner agreed and said Cal should charge extra for old guys who wanted to pretend they were fighters. I turned back to the bag and hit it 6 more times. Each punch landing exactly where I wanted it, the impact solid and controlled. Reyes stopped laughing and watched more carefully, His partner said something to him I couldn't hear, and they walked away, but I could feel Reyes watching me from across the gym for the next 10 minutes. Cal came over after my workout and asked where I'd learned to hit a bag properly. I said I'd done some boxing when I was younger, nothing serious. He studied my face for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, and I worried he might recognize me. 4 years wasn't that long, and my fights had been televised across Europe. I'd aged badly since then, lost 20 pounds of muscle, grew a beard, and wore glasses I didn't actually need. But my face was still my face, and if Cal had followed European boxing at all, he might make the connection. He asked what gym I'd trained at before, and I lied and said a small place in Philadelphia that closed down years ago. Cal accepted that and told me I had decent form for someone who claimed boxing wasn't serious. He said if I kept coming regularly, he might let me spar with some of the beginners. I thanked him and left before he could ask more questions, my hands trembling as I drove home to my studio apartment in a building where the heat barely worked and the neighbors sold drugs in the stairwell. That evening, I almost didn't go back for the beginners class. I sat in my car outside the gym for 20 minutes, watching other students arrive, all of them younger and more eager than I felt. But I'd paid for the month, and more importantly, I needed to know if I could do this. The class had 12 people, mostly men in their 20s and 30s with a few women mixed in, all of them new to boxing. The instructor was a former lightweight named Tommy Greer, who'd had a decent career before a detached retina ended it. He walked us through basic stance, how to make a proper fist, how to throw a jab without hurting our wrists. It was information I'd learned at age 12, but I followed along and made the same mistakes the other beginners made. Tommy corrected my stance twice, even though I could have taught the class myself. After 45 minutes of fundamentals, Tommy paired us up for light pad work. I got partnered with a guy named Lucas, who worked in IT, and said he'd always wanted to try boxing after watching those viral videos of street fights. He held the pads wrong, and I adjusted them for him, showing him the proper angle and how to absorb impact. When it was my turn to hit, I threw soft jabs that barely moved the pads, playing the role of uncertain beginner. Lucas said I was pretty good for my first day, and I thanked him while dying inside. The second week, Reyes started paying more attention to me. He'd stop his training to watch when I was on the heavy bag, studying my combinations and footwork. I tried to keep everything basic and slow, but muscle memory kept taking over. My body wanted to move the way Boris had taught me, wanted to slip and counter and pivot the way I'd done thousands of times. After one session, Reyes approached me in the locker room and asked directly if I'd fought professionally. I said no, just amateur stuff years ago, nothing worth mentioning. He didn't look convinced. He said my hands moved too clean for an amateur, that I had the relaxation and timing of someone who'd been in real fights. I told him he was giving me too much credit, that I'd just watched a lot of training videos online. Reyes laughed and said watching videos didn't teach you how to sit down on your punches the way I did. His partner, whose name I'd learned was Andre, suggested maybe I was a washed-up pro trying to hide my past. The comment hit too close to truth, and my face must have shown something because both of them went quiet. I grabbed my bag and left without responding, my heart pounding from more than just the workout. Cal pulled me aside the next day before I started training. He said some of the fighters were asking questions about my background, and he needed to know if I was being honest about my experience. I could see the suspicion in his eyes, the way he was measuring me, trying to decide if I was worth the trouble. I told him the truth, or a version of it. I said I'd boxed seriously when I was younger in Europe, had some amateur success, but quit after a bad injury and hadn't fought in years. I didn't mention the name Dante Kozlov, or the 23 professional wins, or the fact that I'd killed a man. Cal processed this and said he appreciated the honesty, but wondered why I was pretending to be a beginner. I explained that I'd been away from boxing for a long time and wanted to ease back in slowly. Didn't want attention or pressure or expectations. Cal seemed to accept this. He said the gym had a few guys with shady pasts who'd reinvented themselves, and as long as I wasn't causing problems, he didn't care what I'd done before. He did say that if I kept attending beginner classes while clearly being advanced, it would be disrespectful to Tommy and the other students. He suggested I join the competitive team practices instead, where the skill level would match mine better. I agreed, knowing I'd just lost my cover. The competitive team trained every morning at 5 a.m. and consisted of 8 fighters, ranging from amateur prospects to regional professionals trying to climb the ranks. Reyes was there, along with Andre and 5 others, including one female fighter named Jasmine Okafor, who'd won the state championship 2 years running. They all looked at me with curiosity when I showed up that first morning at 5 a.m., none of them sure what to make of the quiet guy from beginner's class who apparently had serious experience. Cal introduced me as Danny and said I'd be joining their training group. Reyes immediately asked if we could spar, and Cal said maybe in a few weeks once he'd evaluated my current condition. The workout was intense. 2 hours of combinations, footwork drills, heavy bag work, speed bag, conditioning exercises that left everyone gasping. I kept pace with them, and by the end, several fighters were watching me with new respect. Jasmine asked me afterward what weight class I'd fought in, and I told her middleweight. She said I was too skinny for middleweight now and looked more like a welterweight. I said I'd lost weight since quitting boxing, which was true. I'd lost weight from stress and guilt, and not caring whether I ate or slept or existed. 2 weeks into training with the competitive team, Cal announced that the gym would be hosting a smoker event in 3 weeks, an unsanctioned amateur boxing night where local gyms brought fighters to compete in front of a small crowd. He said everyone on the team was expected to participate, and he started pairing people up for potential matches. When he got to me, he hesitated. He asked if I felt ready to fight, and I said I didn't know. Reyes immediately volunteered to fight me, saying he wanted to see what the mysterious European could do. Cal considered this and said it could work since we were roughly the same size. I started to refuse, started to explain that I hadn't fought in 4 years and wasn't sure I was mentally ready. But something in Reyes's expression, the cocky certainty that he'd beat me easily, made me agree. I needed to know if I could step into a ring again without freezing, needed to know if I could throw punches at someone who was trying to hurt me without seeing Victor's face. Cal scheduled us for the main event of the smoker, 5 rounds at welterweight, and suddenly I had 3 weeks to prepare for my first fight since Budapest. The training intensity increased as the smoker approached. I worked with Tommy on pad drills, with Jasmine on defensive movement, with Cal on strategy and ring generalship. The rust came off slowly, but steadily. My timing returned, my reflexes sharpened, my conditioning improved. But every time I visualized the fight, I saw Victor collapsing instead of Reyes. I saw the referee waving off the fight and doctors rushing into the ring and Victor's corner screaming at me in Hungarian while I stood frozen with my gloves still raised. I'd been having nightmares about Budapest since it happened, but they intensified as the smoker date approached. I'd wake up sweating, my hands clenched into fists, my wife's voice echoing in my memory telling me she couldn't be married to someone who'd killed a man even if it was an accident. Some nights I'd get out of bed and practice shadow boxing in my tiny apartment at 3 a.m., throwing combinations at invisible opponents until I was too exhausted to dream. My therapist said I was using boxing as both the source of my trauma and the method of processing it, which seemed unhealthy. I stopped going to therapy. 1 week before the smoker, a man in an expensive suit showed up at the gym looking for me. He introduced himself as Leonard Voss, a boxing manager and promoter who worked with fighters in the Northeast region. He said he'd been watching me train through the gym's windows and recognized my style, the specific way I set up my left hook and managed distance. He asked if I'd ever fought under the name Dante Kozlov. The gym went silent. Every fighter stopped working and turned to look at me. I could have lied, could have denied it, but Leonard clearly knew the truth and was just giving me the chance to admit it. I said yes, I'd been Dante Kozlov, and I'd quit boxing after the Victor Popov fight. Leonard nodded slowly and said he'd thought so. He'd promoted Victor's previous 3 fights and had been at the Budapest event that night. He'd watched me kill Victor from ringside. The words hung in the air, and I saw the faces of the other fighters change as they processed what they'd just heard. Reyes looked shocked. Andre looked sick. Jasmine looked at my hands as if seeing them for the first time. Leonard said he hadn't recognized me at first because I looked so different, but my movement patterns were unmistakable. He asked why I was fighting in a low-level smoker when I'd been a legitimate title contender. I explained about the lawsuit, the guilt, the need to leave boxing behind and start over. Leonard listened without judgment and said he understood trauma, but thought I was wasting my talent hiding in a gym fighting nobodies. He said if I was serious about boxing again, He could get me real fights, sanctioned bouts against ranked opponents, a path back to the level I'd been at before Budapest. I told him I wasn't interested in that life anymore. Leonard handed me his business card anyway and said to call him if I changed my mind. After he left, the gym stayed quiet for a long moment. Then Reyes said, "You killed someone?" His voice was different now, not cocky or mocking, just genuinely unsettled. I explained what happened in Budapest, the undiagnosed aneurysm, the investigation that cleared me, the family's lawsuit, all of it spilling out in a rush because I was tired of hiding. Cal asked why I hadn't told him any of this from the start. I said I'd wanted to leave Dante Kozlov dead and buried with Victor, wanted to be just Danny Cole, amateur boxer, nobody special. Tommy asked if I was still planning to fight Reyes at the Smoker. I said I'd withdraw if people felt uncomfortable, but Reyes immediately said no, the fight was happening. His voice had a different quality now, less cocky and more respectful, maybe even nervous. He said he'd trained for 3 weeks and wasn't backing out regardless of my past. Cal said the fight would proceed as scheduled, but made me promise I'd pull my punches and keep it technical rather than trying to hurt anyone. I promised, though we both knew that once you're in the ring and someone is hitting you, instinct takes over. The next few days of training were awkward. Everyone treated me differently, more carefully, as if I might snap and hurt someone. Andre stopped talking to me entirely. Jasmine asked me once if I had nightmares about Victor, and I said yes, every night. She said she'd had a sparring partner get seriously hurt once, a freak accident with a head clash, and the guilt had almost made her quit boxing. She understood in a way the others didn't. That conversation helped more than 6 months of therapy had. The night before the Smoker, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, remembering Budapest in excruciating detail. The crowd had been loud and energetic, mostly Hungarian fans supporting Victor, the local favorite. I'd been the foreign challenger, the Russian nobody expected to win. The first 2 rounds had been competitive, both of us feeling each other out, landing occasional clean shots. Victor was tough and skilled, a pressure fighter who wanted to walk me down and break my will. In the 3rd round, he caught me with a hard right hand that hurt, and I'd circled away, reset, then countered with a left hook when he pressed forward. The punch landed perfectly on his temple, and Victor's legs went stiff immediately. He fell straight back, his head bouncing off the canvas with a sound I still heard in dreams. The referee counted, but Victor didn't move. At 8 seconds, the ringside doctor jumped in and waved off the count. By 10 seconds, there were 6 people in the ring around Victor's motionless body. I'd stood in the corner, confused, watching them work on him, watching them lift his eyelids and shine lights and shake him and finally start chest compressions. The ambulance took 20 minutes to arrive because of traffic, and by then, Victor had been unconscious for 25 minutes. He died 3 hours later in the hospital without ever waking up. The Smoker was held in a converted warehouse with a regulation ring set up in the center and folding chairs arranged around it for maybe 200 spectators. The crowd was smaller than expected, maybe 80 people, mostly friends and family of the fighters plus some local boxing enthusiasts. Cal had organized 8 bouts starting with 4-round amateur matches and building toward my fight with Reyes as the main event. I sat in the makeshift locker room, wrapping my hands with the care Boris had taught me 15 years ago, each wrap precise and tight. Tommy came in to check my hands and said I looked calm for someone about to have their first fight in 4 years. I didn't tell him about the panic attack I'd had in the parking lot an hour ago, or that I'd vomited twice from nervousness, or that I'd seriously considered getting in my car and driving back to my apartment. Jasmine had fought earlier and won a decision, and she stopped by to tell me good luck and remind me that Reyes had good speed, but left his right hand low after throwing his jab. Information I'd already noticed, but appreciated hearing confirmed. Andre came in and apologized for being weird after learning about Victor. He said he'd done research and read about the investigation, and knew it wasn't my fault. I thanked him, though his forgiveness didn't make me feel any less guilty. Cal called me to the ring at 9:30 p.m. The crowd was louder now, warmed up by the earlier fights, ready for the main event. I climbed through the ropes and looked across the ring at Reyes, who was bouncing on his toes, throwing shadow punches, looking confident. The referee called us to the center for instructions. Standard smoker rules, 5 2-minute rounds, 16-ounce gloves, no standing 8 count, referee stops the fight if anyone is hurt or 2 outmatched. Reyes and I touched gloves, and I saw something in his eyes that worried me. He wasn't just here to box. He wanted to prove he could hang with someone who'd been a professional, wanted to test himself against a killer, wanted to show everyone watching that he belonged at a higher level. I recognized that look because I'd had it myself at his age. The bell rang, and we came out of our corners. Reyes immediately pressed forward, throwing a jab-cross combination that I slipped easily. I circled left, staying out of range, measuring his timing and distance. He threw a hook that missed by inches, and I countered with a light jab that snapped his head back. The crowd reacted, and Reyes's expression hardened. He threw another combination, this one faster and more committed, and I blocked most of it but felt a solid right hand get through my guard and land on my cheekbone. The impact brought back everything. Suddenly I wasn't in a warehouse in America fighting Reyes. I was in Budapest fighting Victor, and the punch that landed on my cheek was Victor's right hand from round 3. I froze completely for maybe 2 seconds, my arms down, my mind locked in the past. Reyes saw the opening and threw a left hook aimed at my head. Instinct took over, and I slipped the punch while simultaneously countering with my own left hook, the same punch that had killed Victor. The punch landed clean on Reyes's jaw and his legs buckled. I saw him falling and saw Victor falling, and they were the same person, the same moment, the same nightmare repeating. Reyes hit the canvas, and I stood over him, my hand still raised, my mind fracturing. The referee pushed me back to a neutral corner and started counting. Reyes was moving, shaking his head, trying to get his bearings. At 6, he got to his knees. At 8, he stood up, wobbly but conscious. The referee checked him and allowed the fight to continue. We had 30 seconds left in the round. Reyes came forward again, hurt but aggressive, and I circled away, refusing to throw punches, just defending and moving until the bell rang. Between rounds, Tommy told me to stay aggressive, said I had Reyes hurt and should finish him. I couldn't explain that I was terrified of finishing anyone, terrified that one more good punch would put Reyes down permanently. Cal came over and looked at my eyes and knew something was wrong. He asked if I wanted to stop the fight, and I said no, I needed to finish this, needed to prove I could step in a ring and not kill someone. Round 2 started and Reyes was more cautious, circling and jabbing, trying to recover from the knockdown. I matched his caution, throwing single punches with no power behind them, basically sparring instead of fighting. The crowd started booing, sensing that I was holding back. Reyes got frustrated and started taunting me, telling me to fight him for real, calling me scared and washed up. The taunts didn't work because I was scared of my own hands and what they'd done. Round 3 was more of the same, technical boxing with no real danger for either fighter. By round 4, even the referee looked bored. He told us between rounds to pick up the pace or he'd stop the fight for inactivity. Reyes must have decided he couldn't win by boxing me, so he changed tactics. He came out in round 4 and rushed me, throwing wild haymakers, trying to land something big. One punch caught me on the temple and stunned me badly. I stumbled backward into the ropes and Reyes jumped on me, throwing rapid combinations to my body and head. The crowd was screaming. Tommy was yelling for me to tie him up. Cal was shouting something I couldn't hear. And all I could think about was Victor, about how he'd pressed forward in round 3 just before I threw the punch, about how his family had looked at me in the courtroom during the lawsuit, about how my wife had packed her belongings and left without saying goodbye. Reyes landed another hard shot to my body, and the pain snapped me back to the present. I wasn't in Budapest. Victor was dead, but Reyes was alive and trying to beat me, and I needed to respond, or the referee would stop the fight. I pushed Reyes back, created space, and threw a 3-punch combination that landed clean. Jab, right hand, left hook. The same sequence I'd thrown 10,000 times in training. The left hook landed on Reyes's jaw again, and he went down hard, his eyes rolling back slightly. The referee immediately jumped in and started waving his arms. Fight over. Technical knockout. I'd knocked out Reyes twice in one fight, and the second one looked bad. The referee was checking Reyes's eyes, while his corner rushed into the ring with smelling salts and water. Reyes was conscious, but clearly dazed, not fully aware of where he was. I stood in my corner watching them work on him and felt the familiar cold dread spreading through my chest. What if the second knockdown had done damage? What if Reyes had an undiagnosed condition just like Victor? What if I'd just killed another man in a boxing ring? The crowd was cheering, but all I heard was the screaming from Budapest. Tommy was trying to celebrate with me, but I pushed past him and climbed out of the ring. I walked straight to the locker room, tore off my gloves, and sat on the bench with my head in my hands while having a complete breakdown. Cal found me 20 minutes later, still sitting there, still shaking. He said Reyes was fine, just rattled from the second knockdown, already walking around and talking normally. He'd been cleared by the ringside doctor and would be okay. The words should have been comforting, but they didn't help. I told Cal I couldn't do this again, couldn't step into a ring knowing what my hands could do. Cal sat down next to me and told me that Victor's death wasn't my fault, that anyone who'd researched the incident knew about the aneurysm and the medical examiner's report. He said boxing was dangerous, and everyone who stepped into a ring accepted that risk. I said I understood that intellectually, but it didn't change how I felt emotionally. Cal asked what I planned to do now. I said I'd go back to construction work and pretend the past 4 weeks never happened. Cal said that would be a waste, that I clearly still had elite skills and could make money fighting professionally again if I wanted. I told him about Leonard Voss's offer and said I wasn't interested in returning to that level of competition. Cal said he understood, but asked me to think about it before making any final decisions. He said the smoker had been a success despite my hesitation, and several people had asked about me afterward, wanting to know if I'd fight again. I didn't return to the gym for a week. I went back to my construction job, pouring concrete and hanging drywall with men who didn't know or care about boxing. My hands hurt from the work, but physical pain was easier to deal with than emotional pain. My therapist, whom I'd started seeing again, said I was running from my trauma rather than processing it. She said until I could forgive myself for Victor's death, I'd never be able to move forward in any meaningful way. I said forgiveness seemed impossible when Victor's family had lost a son and husband because I'd thrown a punch. She asked if I thought Victor would have wanted me to destroy my own life over an accident. I said I'd never met Victor outside the ring, had no idea what he would have wanted, and it felt presumptuous to speculate. The therapy session went nowhere as usual. The construction foreman asked if I was planning to keep working, or if I was going back to whatever I'd been doing before I showed up 4 months ago. I realized I didn't have an answer. Boxing had defined my entire life from age 12 to 28, and then I'd spent 4 years pretending I wasn't a boxer. But avoiding boxing hadn't made the guilt go away. It had just left me hollow and directionless. Leonard Voss called my cell phone on a Friday evening 2 weeks after the smoker. He said he'd heard about my fight with Reyes and wanted to reiterate his offer to manage me. He had a fight lined up in Atlantic City in 8 weeks, a 10-round welterweight bout against a ranked opponent, good money, legitimate competition. I asked how he'd gotten my number, and he said Cal had given it to him. I asked Cal about it the next day, and he admitted Leonard had been persistent, calling multiple times, offering Cal a finder's fee if he could convince me to fight professionally again. Cal said he'd refused the money, but gave Leonard my number because he thought I needed to hear the offer directly. I was angry at first. But Cal said he'd watched me for weeks and could see that I was stuck between my past and my future. He said Leonard's offer was a chance to move forward instead of staying paralyzed. I told Cal that moving forward meant accepting I was a fighter who'd killed someone, and I didn't know if I could build a life on that foundation. Cal said boxing was what I did, not who I was, and that Victor's death didn't define me unless I let it. The words sounded true, but I didn't know how to believe them. I called Leonard 3 days later and said I'd take the Atlantic City fight. He sounded genuinely happy and said he'd send over contracts immediately. The purse was $15,000, which was decent money for a comeback fight at my level. My opponent was a fighter named Damon Sterling, with a record of 18 wins and 4 losses, all 4 losses coming against top-ranked contenders. Sterling was a gatekeeper, someone promoters used to test whether rising fighters were ready for elite competition. If I beat Sterling, it would signal I was back for real. If I lost, Leonard would probably drop me and my comeback would end before it really started. The fight gave me a concrete goal for the first time in 4 years. I started training seriously again, not just to stay in shape, but to prepare for a specific opponent. Cal connected me with a nutritionist to help me gain back some of the muscle I'd lost. Tommy worked with me on ring strategy, Jasmine sparred with me 3 times a week, pushing my conditioning and reflexes. Even Reyes, who'd recovered fully from our fight, offered to help with training. He said getting knocked out by me had taught him more about boxing than winning 20 fights against weaker opponents. I appreciated the maturity he'd shown, and we developed a mutual respect that hadn't existed before. 6 weeks into training camp, an investigative journalist named Stephanie Walden contacted me asking for an interview. She was writing an article about safety protocols in professional boxing and wanted to discuss Viktor Popov's death. I immediately declined, but she was persistent, calling multiple times and eventually showing up at the gym. She said she'd obtained medical records from the Budapest fight through a Freedom of Information request in Hungary, and the records raised questions about the pre-fight medical screening Viktor had received. She showed me documents indicating that Viktor had complained of headaches to the commission doctor 2 days before our fight, but the doctor had cleared him anyway without ordering any additional tests. The implication was that the aneurysm might have been detected if proper protocols had been followed, and Viktor's death might have been preventable. I felt sick reading the documents. Stephanie said she was building a case that boxing commissions around the world were failing to properly screen fighters, that Viktor was just one of multiple deaths that could have been prevented with better medical oversight. She wanted my perspective as the fighter who'd thrown the fatal punch. I told her I'd think about it, and she gave me her card, saying the article was running in 3 weeks, with or without my input. I showed the documents to Cal and Tommy, and both of them looked troubled. Tommy said commission doctors were often overworked and underpaid, dealing with hundreds of fighters and taking shortcuts to get through the workload. Cal said he'd personally known fighters who'd competed with concussions or other injuries because the doctor's exam was cursory at best. Neither of them excused what had happened to Viktor, but they confirmed that the system had serious problems. I spent the next week thinking about Stephanie's article and what it could mean. If Viktor's death was partially caused by negligent medical screening, then maybe I wasn't entirely responsible. Maybe the guilt I'd been carrying should have been shared with the commission doctor who'd cleared Viktor despite warning signs. The thought didn't absolve me completely, but it shifted something in how I understood what had happened. I called Stephanie and agreed to the interview, but only if she'd let me review what she wrote about me before publication. She agreed, and we met at a coffee shop where I spent 3 hours recounting the Budapest fight in excruciating detail. I told her about the punch, the knockdown, the chaos afterward, the investigation, the lawsuit, my wife leaving, everything. Stephanie recorded it all and said my account would be the emotional center of her article, showing the human cost of systemic failure in boxing safety. The article ran 2 weeks before my Atlantic City fight, published in a major sports magazine with nationwide distribution. The headline was, "Preventable Deaths: How Boxing's Failed Safety Protocols Are Killing Fighters." Stephanie's article detailed 6 deaths in professional boxing over the past decade, all involving fighters who'd shown warning signs before their fatal bouts. Viktor's case was featured prominently, with the documents showing his pre-fight headache complaints and the doctor's inadequate response. My interview was included, with quotes about the guilt I'd carried and my belief that better medical screening might have saved Viktor's life. The article sparked immediate controversy. Boxing commissions defended their protocols, saying every fighter death was tragic, but that the sport had inherent risks. Medical experts argued that current screening was insufficient and that MRI scans should be mandatory before every fight. Fighters' advocacy groups demanded reform, and Viktor's family, whom I hadn't heard from in 3 years, issued a statement through their lawyer saying they'd always believed the commission had failed their son and appreciated that someone was finally investigating what had really happened. The statement didn't absolve me, but it acknowledged that I wasn't the only one responsible. The controversy around Stephanie's article brought unexpected attention to my comeback fight. Suddenly, it wasn't just a mid-level welterweight bout in Atlantic City. It was a statement about whether a fighter who'd killed someone could or should be allowed to compete again. Opinion pieces debated my right to return to boxing. Social media exploded with arguments about trauma, responsibility, and redemption. Some people said I should be banned from boxing permanently as a matter of principle. Others said Viktor's death had been an accident compounded by systemic failure, and I deserved a second chance. Leonard said the controversy was actually good for ticket sales, that the fight would now draw serious attention. I didn't care about ticket sales. I cared about stepping into the ring without destroying another person's life. Cal said the increased scrutiny meant the athletic commission would ensure the highest safety standards for my fight, which should provide some comfort. It didn't. Comfort wasn't possible when you'd watched someone die from your punch. I arrived in Atlantic City 3 days before the fight for final preparations and media obligations. The weigh-in was tense, with maybe 50 reporters present instead of the usual handful for a fight at this level. Damon Sterling and I faced off for the cameras, and I could see he was aware of the controversy surrounding me. Someone asked him during the press conference if he was worried about fighting a man who'd killed an opponent. Sterling said he'd reviewed Victor's case thoroughly and didn't hold me responsible, but he planned to win the fight regardless of my past. He was professional about it, which I appreciated. Someone asked me how I could justify returning to boxing after what happened in Budapest. I said I couldn't justify it except to say that boxing was who I was, and running from that hadn't helped anyone. I said I hoped the attention from Stephanie's article would lead to real reforms in fighter safety so that what happened to Victor wouldn't happen to someone else. The answer satisfied some reporters and outraged others. Leonard pulled me away from the press conference before things could escalate further. The night before the fight, I couldn't sleep. I reviewed footage of Sterling's previous fights, studying his patterns and tendencies. He was a pressure fighter who liked to work the body and break down opponents over the course of 10 rounds. He had good stamina and a solid chin, having never been knocked out despite fighting tough competition. Beating him would require boxing intelligently for the full 30 minutes, not looking for a single knockout punch. That actually made me feel better. I didn't want to knock anyone out. I wanted to win a clear decision where my opponent walked out of the ring, healthy and uninjured. Cal came to my hotel room around midnight to check on me, and I admitted I was terrified of hurting Sterling. Cal said that fear would make me tentative, and tentative fighters got hurt. He said I needed to commit fully to my punches, while trusting the referee to stop the fight if anyone was in real danger. The advice was sound, but hard to internalize when my last committed punch had killed someone. Cal stayed and talked with me until 2 a.m., sharing stories about his own career, the fights he'd won and lost, the injuries he'd sustained and caused, the way boxing had given him purpose even when it took pieces of him in return. His honesty helped more than any motivational speech could have. Fight night arrived, and the arena was surprisingly full, maybe 3,000 people in attendance, far more than a typical mid-level welterweight bout would draw. The controversy had turned the fight into an event. I could hear mixed reactions from the crowd as I made my walkout, some people cheering and others booing, nobody indifferent. Sterling got a warm reception, positioned as the sympathetic opponent facing the controversial killer. The referee called us to the center for instructions, and I noticed he spent extra time explaining the rules, emphasizing that he'd stop the fight immediately if either fighter was hurt. The message was clear. He wasn't taking any chances, given my history. Sterling and I touched gloves and returned to our corners. The bell rang, and we met in the center of the ring. Sterling came forward immediately, establishing his pressure-fighting style, throwing jabs and working to cut off the ring. I circled left, staying mobile, countering with my own jab when he got too close. The first round was feeling-out process, both of us measuring distance and timing. I won the round narrowly on activity, but nothing significant happened. Between rounds, Tommy told me to start sitting down on my right hand, that Sterling was leaving it open when he threw his jab. I said I'd work on it, though I was still hesitant to throw power punches. Round 2 saw Sterling increase his aggression, targeting my body with hooks that landed solidly. The body shots hurt and slowed my movement. Tommy was right about the opening for my right hand, and midway through the round I threw it hard for the first time, landing clean on Sterling's jaw. His head snapped back and his legs wavered slightly, but he didn't go down. I'd hurt him, but not badly. He circled away, recovered, and came back with renewed caution. The round ended with me ahead, but Sterling proving he could take my power. Round 3 was tactical, both of us boxing carefully, landing occasional clean shots, but neither willing to take big risks. Sterling was winning the body attack, and I could feel my stamina being affected. Rounds 4 and 5 were close, competitive rounds where we traded advantages. By round 6, Sterling seemed to be winning on points, his consistent body work outscoring my cleaner but less frequent headshots. Tommy told me between rounds that I needed to pick up the pace, that I was letting Sterling control the fight. Cal added that I was boxing too cautiously, that I needed to commit to my combinations the way I'd done in my prime. I knew they were right, but committing fully meant accepting the risk of seriously hurting Sterling. Round 6 saw me increase my output, throwing more combinations, mixing body and headshots. Sterling responded in kind, and we had the best round of the fight, both landing clean punches, both showing we belonged at this level. The crowd was fully engaged now, cheering every exchange. Round 7 was the turning point. Sterling caught me with a left hook to the body that hurt badly, dropping me to one knee for the first time in my professional career. The referee started counting, and I took the full 8 seconds to recover, using the time to clear my head and assess the damage. My ribs felt bruised, but nothing was broken. The referee let the fight continue, and Sterling came forward looking to finish me. He threw hard combinations, trying to land another body shot that would end the fight. I covered up, moved away, survived until the bell. Between rounds, Tommy worked on my ribs with ice, while Cal told me I needed to dig deep, that Sterling would come out aggressive in round 8, trying to finish what he started. He said I had to meet Sterling's aggression with my own, or the fight was over. Round 8 began, and Sterling pressed forward as predicted. But this time I stood my ground instead of circling away. We exchanged punches in the center of the ring, both landing, both hurt, both refusing to back down. The crowd was screaming. I landed a right hand that stunned Sterling, then followed with a left hook, the same punch that had killed Victor. For a split second I hesitated, my body frozen by memory. Sterling saw the opening and threw a desperation uppercut that caught me flush on the chin. Everything went bright white, and my legs turned to rubber. I stumbled backward into the ropes, barely conscious, and Sterling jumped on me, throwing everything he had. The referee was watching closely, ready to stop the fight. I covered up and somehow survived until the bell, saved by the round ending. Tommy and Cal worked frantically between rounds, dumping ice water on my head, shouting instructions I could barely hear through the ringing in my ears. Cal said I'd been hurt badly, that my chin was compromised, that one more shot like that and the fight was over. He said I needed to box smart in rounds 9 and 10, stay away from Sterling's power, use my jab and movement to win on points. Tommy said I was still ahead on his scorecard, but it was close, that these last 2 rounds would decide everything. Round 9 started, and I followed the game plan, boxing from distance, using my jab to keep Sterling away, moving constantly to avoid his power shots. Sterling was tired too, his punches coming slower, his footwork less crisp. We were both exhausted, both hurt, both trying to survive until the final bell. I won round 9 clearly by staying disciplined and outboxing Sterling. Going into round 10, I was probably ahead, but not by enough to coast. I needed to win the final round, or at least not lose it badly. The bell rang for the last time, and we came out cautiously, both knowing this round would determine the fight. Sterling tried to mount one final surge, but didn't have the energy. I countered his attacks with combinations, landing the cleaner punches, controlling the ring center. With 1 minute left, Sterling caught me with another body shot that hurt, but I fired back with a 3-punch combination that snapped his head back. The crowd was on their feet for the final 30 seconds as we exchanged everything we had left. The bell rang, ending the fight, and we embraced in the center of the ring, both of us knowing we'd given everything. The referee raised both our hands while we waited for the judge's decision. The announcement came after what felt like an hour, but was probably 90 seconds. The judges scored it 96-94, 96-94, 95-95, a majority decision for me. I'd won. I'd stepped into a ring 4 years after killing Victor Popov and won a legitimate fight against a ranked opponent. More importantly, Damon Sterling was standing next to me, hurt but healthy, smiling despite the loss. I hadn't killed anyone, hadn't even knocked anyone down, had just boxed well and won fairly. The relief I felt was so intense I started crying in the ring, tears running down my face while the crowd cheered and booed in equal measure. Sterling hugged me and said it had been an honor to share the ring with me. Leonard climbed through the ropes celebrating and talking about future fights. Cal and Tommy were shouting congratulations. But I could barely process any of it because for the first time in 4 years, I felt something other than guilt. I felt like maybe I could do this. Maybe I could be Dante Kozlov again, without it meaning I was a killer, Maybe boxing could be something I did rather than something that defined my nightmares. The celebrating continued in the locker room and later at a restaurant where Leonard bought everyone dinner. People kept asking me how it felt to win my comeback fight, and I kept saying it felt good, which was inadequate, but true. What I couldn't articulate was that the win mattered less than the fact that my opponent had walked away healthy. That was the real victory. Sterling joined us for dinner, showing the kind of class I hadn't expected. We talked about the fight, about boxing in general, about our respective careers. He said he'd fought me clean and fair, and I'd been the better man that night. I returned the compliment and meant it. He'd pushed me harder than anyone since Budapest, and proven I could still compete at a high level. After dinner, I walked back to my hotel alone, wanting time to process everything. My phone had dozens of messages congratulating me or condemning me, depending on the sender's perspective on whether I should have been allowed to fight. I ignored all of them and called my therapist instead. She answered on the third ring, and I told her I'd won my fight and nobody had gotten hurt. She said she was proud of me for confronting my trauma directly. I said I still felt guilty about Victor, probably always would, but maybe I could carry that guilt without letting it destroy me. She said that sounded like progress, and for the first time, I agreed. I flew home the next day and returned to training at Southside, where the fighters welcomed me back as one of their own. Leonard called with offers for future fights, and I accepted a bout scheduled for 3 months out, another step in rebuilding my career. Stephanie Walden's article continued generating attention, and 2 boxing commissions announced they were revising their medical screening protocols, implementing mandatory brain scans for all fighters. The changes came too late for Victor, but might save future lives. His family's lawyer contacted me, saying they appreciated my participation in Stephanie's article and hoped the reforms would honor Victor's memory. The message didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't offer closure, just acknowledged that we'd all been victims of a failed system. I kept training, kept fighting, winning 4 more bouts over the next year while working with Stephanie to advocate for better safety standards in boxing. The guilt over Victor never fully disappeared, but I learned to channel it into making the sport safer rather than running from my past. Cal said I'd become a better fighter and better person by facing what I'd done instead of hiding from it. Maybe he was right. I was Dante Kozlov again, the name no longer synonymous with killer, but with survivor, someone who'd made a tragic mistake and was spending the rest of his life trying to prevent others from experiencing the same tragedy. That wasn't redemption exactly, but it was something I could live with. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.